The music of Star Wars. Or is it? We'll find out in a little bit. As you all know, 43 years ago, in fact, it was 43 years ago this week that Star Wars premiered in 1977. And when it did, it changed the way that movies were viewed for all time. A big part of that was the score that John Williams wrote, and it it changed the way that movies were scored for all time as well. In the 70s, if you might remember back to that time, movie soundtracks and movie scores were not what they are today. They were not big, epic, symphonic scores. They were sometimes experimental. They were generally much shorter. For any given score, a composer might need to write maybe 25 or 30 minutes of music at most, because the movies were an hour and a half to 2 hours long, and most of it was either not scored at all, or many of the scenes would be scored by popular songs or other background music, but not by a soundtrack score. So the composers didn't have to write a heck of a lot of music. And what they did write was generally scored for smaller ensembles. They often were experimental. If you think back, for some of you who know movie scores, things like the score for Taxi Driver, um, or actually one of my favorites, the score for Planet of the Apes, which is a fantastic movie score in its own right, but has very little to do with a symphony orchestra. Um, with Star Wars, what John Williams was doing was harking back to an older style of composing for movies, of style that was much more suited to the 1930s than the 1970s. And in so doing, what he ushered in was a new era of composing for film. Um, he was one of the big proponents of it. Another one at the time was Jerry Goldsmith, and then later James Horner. And those composers in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s really redefined what movie music is supposed to be. So the fact of the matter is, John Williams was the one that started it all. It wasn't only Star Wars. Also in 1977, he also wrote the score for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was another hit. It was kind of a 1-2 punch for that year, which had a very different feel in terms of its thematic structure and style, but it also was a symphonic score. And of course, a couple years before that, one of his big breakthrough scores was Jaws, which we all remember to this day. So John Williams was the one who really redefined this for us, and Star Wars was the movie that did it. Here, we need to talk a little bit about why movies need music. So here's the question. A movie is a visual medium. There are people talking to each other. There are people walking around, doing actions, fighting, or having a car chase, or involved in any various of 100 various things that they do in a movie. Why does it need background music? Well, there's a couple of reasons, of course, but the main reason being heightened drama. Music makes the scene more dramatic. But one of the other ones that he does very, very well, um, and this is something that John Williams does really, really well, is, oh wow, look at all these wonderful people, is to create mood and to convey a character without dialogue. Um, the simple fact of the matter is that in Star Wars, it's a little interesting to see when you watch the movie from the perspective of music. You can get to see exactly how much of the movie has no dialogue in it whatsoever. And the fact of the matter is, what you're getting in terms of character development comes solely from the music. That's the incredible part about it. It really doesn't have anything to do with what the characters are saying. It has to do with what the music is telling you in the background. So let me show you a little bit exactly what I mean. This is a wonderful example of it. This is one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, and that is what's known as the binary sunset scene. So here's the scene without the music. So, doesn't tell you much, does it? Really doesn't have much to say at all. What it shows you is, somebody looking at a sunset, and there is nothing to tell you what he's thinking or what's going on in the character's mind in that moment. Well, if you add the music back in, of course, what you get is one of the most emotionally moving moments in the entire film. So there you go. One of the single most beautiful themes in the entire saga. That's now come to be known as the Force theme, and it's associated with the old Republic and the rebels who are trying to destroy the Empire. But what it does is tell you all about what the character's thinking inside 30 seconds without having to hear a single word come out of his mouth. Luke's looking off into the future, trying to find something better, greater than himself, and that's exactly what you're supposed to feel. That's the only way you can feel it in that scene is with the music. Without the music, there's nothing to guide you. One more scene to show you. This is actually the opening scene of the film, and it opens onto this epic space battle. Now, the space battle is kind of exciting, but at the same time, once again, there's no dialogue. There's nothing to tell you what's going on and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. So here's a little bit of the opening scene.
The main reactor will be destroyed for sure. This is madness. You're doomed. That
So again, there's really nothing to tell you who's the antagonist and who's the protagonist in this scene. Is it the little ship? Is it the big ship? Um, is the big ship capturing some bad guy rebels, or the rebels running away from the bad guy empire? Well, the thing that tells you, of course, is John Williams' score.
This is madness. We're doomed. There'll be no escape for the princess this time. What's that?
So there you go. Well, the simple fact of the matter is that what John Williams had to do was to write almost an hour and 45 minutes worth of music for a movie that's slightly less than 2 hours. And he had about 2 months to do it in. So what he did was he relied on a very wonderful method, a wonderful trick that was created by this guy, Richard Wagner. Um, he certainly wasn't the first person to try and do this, but he was the composer who is most associated with the the method that John Williams used in Star Wars and in so many films to create character, mood, drama. And it's a wonderful German word called a leitmotif. The leitmotif is basically a signature tune. Now, for Wagner's Ring Cycle, this is where he really put it all together. His Gesamtkunstwerk, the grand unified artwork of combining the staging and the costumes and the music and the lyrics and the characters all in one grand idea. That's where Wagner reached his height, was with the Ring Cycle. And each character had a leitmotif, a signature tune, that would be identified with them. It was sometimes with characters, it was sometimes with objects, and sometimes with situations. And what John Williams did was, in creating that score for Star Wars, he did exactly the same thing. There was a theme for the Empire, and a theme for the Rebels, and a theme for Luke himself, and a theme for Princess Leia. And in putting all those together, what he had to do was to draw on his experience as a musician and as a composer. And what happens with composers is, there really isn't any way to write something without hearing something else first. Every composer has their influences. And in John Williams' case, sometimes they come through in slightly more clear ways than others. And in that opening scene that you just saw, there's actually three separate tunes, three separate motives that are clearly heard and clearly sourced from different places. One of them is the work of Richard Strauss. Strauss was he's actually one of my favorite composers. He used to call himself the world's greatest B-class composer. Um, but he was much better than that as far as I'm concerned. And Strauss was a writer of tone poems. One of my personal favorites is a tone poem called Ein Heldenleben. And in Ein Heldenleben, it's an autobiographical piece for Strauss anyway. He considers himself the hero. Um, but he wrote a battle scene. And John Williams, actually, in talking about the score for Star Wars, would refer to his what he called generic battle music. And there's a moment in it that in Ein Heldenleben that John Williams lifted straight out. And I'll show you, see if you can hear it. But I'll show and I'll show it to you twice so you can really catch what happens. So here's a little bit of Ein Heldenleben. So see if you could catch it. It happened right about the second half that little rhythmic motive. Dum ba-dum ba-da-da-da-dum ba-dum ba-da-da-da-dum. Well, keep that in the back of your mind. Because along with that, we're going to add something by Paul Dukas. Dukas was another composer who wrote some tone poems. And he wrote a tone poem in the late 19th century, one of my absolute favorites, um, which was adapted by Disney into a film that starred one of my favorite actors when I was a child, Mickey Mouse. Walt Disney's Fantasia, which was released in 1946, had as one of its vignette scenes an adaptation, of course, of Mickey as the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and the music is by Paul Dukas. Um, the Sorcerer's Apprentice is a beautiful, beautiful tone poem, but it has in it another motive that will sound awfully familiar if you listen carefully. So here's a moment, a little snippet from The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Did you catch that one? Here it is again. Ba-da-bum. Well, keep that in your mind, and I'm sure you're putting it all together here. And the final piece of the puzzle is Gustav Holst. Now, Holst wrote a piece that I think could arguably be called the most influential piece of the 20th century, and that is the planets. Um, it was immediately, immediately inspiring to a whole bunch of composers, but it's absolutely incredible description of outer space has become what we believe, what we think of as space music. It really is kind of incredible how influential it's been. Every science fiction movie you've ever seen, and a lot of other films and other genres, use some of the themes and some of the techniques that Holst put into the planets. But for John Williams, it was a moment from Mars, the first movement, Mars, the Bringer of War. This moment is pretty blatant. So let's take a quick listen. So if you take each one of those little snippets, and let's see, I happen to have a piano sitting right next to me here. So one is this one, and then finally this. Well, what you get is the underlying music of that opening scene that we just saw. Let's hear that moment just again, just to make sure. So what he did was to take these tiny little snippets, these little themes of pieces that you may very well have heard before, and place them together to create what he considered called in part his generic battle music. Um, Now, why did he do that? Well, when a film is being made, there's a thing called a temp track. And what's a temp track? But, well, it's temporary music that's placed onto a rough cut of the film so that the director can figure out where he wants music to occur and where he doesn't want it to be. The composer many times will hear the temp track when they're looking at the rough cut, when they're hired to do the score. And the fact of the matter is that many times, especially now, now in 2020, composers very often will be asked specifically, "Hey, this scene has this temp track from Shostakovich. Can you make music that sounds like that?" And just put that in there, but make it original. And as a result, what happens is the composer will be influenced by both the director's wishes and their own experience of seeing the film with that music attached to it, and sometimes it'll get stuck in their heads even if they don't want it to. Sometimes directors, though, sometimes will actually choose to keep the temp track itself and not have original music done. One of the most famous examples of that is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick actually did hire a composer um, to write a score, an original score for 2001. But in the end, he decided that the music that he'd chosen for his various scenes was better. And so in the end, he just, he kept the temp track. And in this case, one of my favorite scenes of 2001, one of everybody's most recognizable scenes from this movie, the Blue Danube Waltz, which in this case is a dance between a space station and a space shuttle. Now, another film that ended up having the same issue of having the temp track was the 1980 film Excalibur, which was John Borman's setting of the Arthur legend. And for Excalibur, he actually decided that he was going to use Wagner. If you are going to have a score that is epic in its in its scope, you may as well have it be Wagner. So this is the opening of Excalibur, which is set to Siegfried's Funeral March from Götterdämmerung. Now, one problem of using the temp track for your movie is that you have to make sure, or try to make sure, that the music will fit exactly what you're trying to show. Um, and in this case, actually, in Excalibur's case, this is a good example of the filmmaker trying to make it work, but not necessarily succeeding. Because if you think about it, the Excalibur theme, the main motive of Siegfried's Funeral March, that pulsing heartbeat sound from the brass, in theory, from the title card, says that you should associate that with Excalibur, the sword itself. But the next time you hear that motive is here. And motive on the screen suddenly is not associated with but with Merlin the sorcerer. So this creates a problem. Dramatically, it's not the same. Not to mention that if you look carefully at the if you look at the screen but listen to the music at the same time very carefully, you'll notice that the downbeat of the music doesn't match the cut of the screen. It's on the screen itself. The screen changes too late to the music. So having a temp track doesn't always work for filmmakers. That's why we have film composers, and thank God that we do. But what happens is with temp track writing, sometimes in the interest of time, a film composer will have what you could call a moment of weakness and steal some music from an existing piece of music. Igor Stravinsky had a wonderful quote. He used to say that good composers borrow, but great composers steal. Well, in this case, John Williams did make one actual steal, and that is this moment, the Dune Sea. This happens early in the film, but well, just take a listen and see exactly what he stole. Yeah, pretty blatant. He did steal it from Stravinsky. Um, Even when I was a kid, when I would listen to the soundtrack, I realized it right away. The moment that I first heard the Rite of Spring, I said, "Wait a minute, that's Star Wars," and of course, it was the other way around. But that's what happens. Sometimes, you do have a short amount of time to write a lot of music. As I said, John Williams had to write an hour and a half's worth of music in less than 2 months, um, which is not an easy task by any stretch. And as a result, sometimes you're going to take a couple of shortcuts. So that's the only real steal. Or is it? Okay, there's a composer I haven't mentioned yet that John Williams was heavily influenced by, and it was this man, Erich Wolfgang Korngold. Erich Korngold was born in Vienna and was a wunderkind composer. He was a child prodigy. Mahler once called him the face of the next generation of composers. And he came to the United States and settled in Los Angeles and began writing music for film. And he was the first of the great film composers of the 1930s and 40s. There was another man, Max Steiner, who was writing around the same time, but Korngold really was the man. He wrote some of the classics, as it's saying, as you can see here, The Adventures of Robin Hood being the absolute best known score from these five. Um, Interesting side note about the Adventures of Robin Hood: when Korngold had been living in LA for a few years, and then he went back to Vienna and decided that he wanted to stay in Vienna for a while. And in 1938 was called by MGM. He received a cable asking if he would come back to LA so that he could write the score for a movie called The Adventures of Robin Hood. And he decided to, said, you know what? Yeah, why not? I'll do it. And he left Vienna for Los Angeles 3 weeks before the Anschluss. And he often referred to The Adventures of Robin Hood as the movie that saved his life, because of course he may not have been able to leave any later than that. The Adventures of Robin Hood was also the first movie to win Best Score, the Oscar for Best Score, where the Oscar was given to the composer and not to the studio. And so Korngold really was the face of Hollywood composition in the 1930s and 40s. And his style is very reminiscent of somebody that that you recognize very often in John Williams. Now, this last movie here, King's Row, there's a little, shall we say, urban myth or conspiracy theory that when George Lucas showed the rough cut of Star Wars to John Williams, that the theme from King's Row was the temp track for the opening. And let's take a listen to it, and I think you'll understand why people think that. Yeah, if you put it alongside this, it does seem awfully familiar. However, this is just an urban myth. This is not true. Um, as far as we can tell, John Williams did not know the score from King's Row very, very well. And actually, he, in 1978, in a documentary about the making of Star Wars, he talked about how he created that main title theme. And it has to do with George Lucas's concept of the hero's journey and how the music will uh, illustrate the hero's journey by climbing but not quite reaching a height and then descending back and then climbing again. It's ba, 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 ba. So that's why he created the theme to sound like that, and it doesn't have much to do with King's Row. However, I want you to take a listen to this piece, Korngold's Violin Concerto. When I was a lot younger, um, I didn't know the music of Korngold yet, and I was in the car driving along to a gig somewhere, and on WQXR came this violin concerto that I didn't know, and it was one of those moments you get in the car and you turn it on and it's in the middle of a piece, the middle of a performance. You say, oh, okay, well, hey, let me listen to this thing. What is this? And the more I listened to it, I was sitting there thinking to myself, did John Williams write a violin concerto? Because the music sounded so familiar, and it wasn't so much the actual themes. It was the orchestration, the way that the orchestra was used, how the brass is used, how the strings are used, the registration of the chords, how the notes are distributed across the orchestra. All of those things were incredibly reminiscent of the scores that I knew and loved from John Williams. So I said to myself, this has to be John Williams. And of course, it turned out to be Korngold's Violin Concerto. This is just a little snippet of it. And when the horns come in towards the end of this clip, you'll understand what I mean. So I don't know exactly which is more incredible in that particular clip. Um, the sound of the orchestra sounding like John Williams, or the effortlessness that Gil Shahan plays that that concerto. He owns that piece. It's just incredible to watch him perform it. But Korngold's style of orchestration was taken by John Williams and by a couple of other composers, but more so by John Williams than anyone else, as the template of how to create the sound for a film. And it's kind of amazing. One small aside I wanted to tell you about, since we had a couple of those moments of what did he steal. The other iconic score that he produced from that time period, Superman, the movie, which to me is the way that Superman is supposed to sound. I don't know about the recent films, but this is the way that Superman is supposed to look and sound. The love theme from Superman was borrowed from, well, as you can see, our old friend, Mr. Richard Strauss. Just take a quick listen. Over here we have the piece that many musicians consider was ruined by John Williams for them because of that moment of the love theme, Death and Transfiguration. Or you start thinking, okay, that's it. John Williams is a talentless hack and has only made his entire fortune by stealing the themes of better better heads than his. Um, the simple truth is that all composers have done this in one way, shape, or form um, over the years. Now, I have on this slide here the term the great synthesizer. That's that's something that can be associated with Bach, with J.S. Bach. Bach was a synthesizer in the sense that he took back in the 18th century the styles of French writing, the French composers, the Italian composers, and the German composers, and kind of put them all together into what you could call kind of a cosmopolitan style. And that's one of the reasons why his music has been so enduring, is that it has that style, that feeling that it could come from anywhere and that it's universal. Um, Part of the way that he got that was by studying the scores of other composers and simply regurgitating them. One of my perfect examples is with the music of Antonio Vivaldi. In order to learn the Italian style, Bach simply took several pieces that Vivaldi wrote, that he obtained the scores for, and rewrote them. Here's the Vivaldi Concerto for Four Violins. And just to make sure you know, this is the Bach keyboard concerto for harpsichords instead of four violins. So he literally did simply transcribe the entire concerto of Vivaldi's Concerto for Four Violins and just put it in for four harpsichords instead. That was his way of learning Vivaldi's style. Um, Another composer who did a little bit of borrowing, and this was something I found out later in life than I probably should have, is some guy named Mozart. Um, I'm sure that most of you know or have heard or have played the Mozart Requiem. It's it's a titan of the repertoire. It's performed over and over again. But I'll bet that you didn't even know that Michael Haydn, Joseph Haydn's brother, wrote a Requiem, let alone what it might sound like. Um, he did. He wrote a Requiem about 20 years before Mozart wrote his. And Mozart and Michael Haydn were good friends. In fact, there was one particular moment where Michael Haydn was commissioned to write a series of duos for violin and viola, and he got sick. He was supposed to write 6, and he only wrote 4, and he needed a hand. And Mozart ended up helping him out by writing 2 duos for him. Funny part is, nowadays we remember the 2 Mozart duos, but we don't hear the Michael Haydn duos, which is too bad because Michael Haydn actually is a much better composer than people give him credit for. He is an unsung hero. And this Requiem, well, I'm going to play just a little bit of it for you just to give you an idea. But the fact of the matter is, if you listen carefully, the opening of this Requiem, the entrance of the voices, the type of orchestra that's being used, the instrumentation that's being used, and even the syncopated accompaniment of to the voices. The orchestra plays this sort of syncopated rhythm that's accompanying the voices. All of it was, well, to put it mildly, borrowed by Mozart. So this is a little bit of Michael Haydn's Requiem. Now, especially that moment at Lux Perpetua. At Lux Perpetua. That was, well, taken. So I guess we could put Mozart into the talentless hack portion of this of this conversation. Um, if you ever have a chance to listen, or better yet, to see a rare performance of the Michael Haydn Requiem, I highly recommend going to see it. It is a beautiful piece, and it honestly should be performed a lot more often than it is. Um, and when the more that you listen to it, the more you will realize that Mozart really did have a template in mind when he started writing his Requiem, and it probably had a lot to do with Michael Haydn. Every composer is influenced by those who came before them. Um, whether conscious or not, things will creep in. The style of a composer that you admire, or a particular theme that just sticks in your head because it is iconic, or that it creates a mood that is not achievable any other way. And John Williams, in creating the score for Star Wars, what he had to deal with was this movie that at the time, it's hard to think about this now with the proliferation of superhero movies and science fiction movies that has happened over the last 30 years or so. But back in 1977, Star Wars was completely groundbreaking. There was nothing that had ever existed like it on film before. And so to many people, it was an alien thing. It was something that was very outside their experience. And what John Williams did, part of the genius of his score, was to take that alien setting, that out of this world setting, and ground it in music that spoke to us because it was familiar. That was the main reason, I think, why the score was celebrated as much as it is And to this day, it is some of the best film music ever written. And it's the kind of rare film music that can be pulled out of its context and still just be great concert music in and of itself. My own humble opinion is that we'll be seeing a lot more John Williams film scores on concert programs in the years to come, simply because it makes sense. It is some of the best known music of our time, and there's no reason why we shouldn't perform it. So before we go, there's one last scene I want to show you. This is the ending scene of Star Wars, and it's the scene without the music. It's another one of those scenes that has no dialogue in it whatsoever. Now, what you're going to hear in this video is a tiny snippet of another movement of the planets, Jupiter. The reason it's there is because that was part of the temp track of the rough cut that George Lucas showed to John Williams. And then what you're going to hear is this video is kind of played for laughs. A couple people, they took the video, the film itself, and they added a little bit of Foley sound effects for laughs. But it does illustrate how ridiculous the scene really is without the music. So here you go, the throne room scene. So yeah, it's pretty ridiculous without the music, but with the music, of course, the majestic and thrilling finish to this great space drama. And so to finish things up, the final throne room scene from Star Wars. One last aside. George Lucas told John Williams that for this scene, as we were talking before about temp tracks, that for this scene, he wanted something that sounded like one of Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance marches. He wanted something that sounded like a processional for a coronation. And that's why you'll hear the Force theme played in a sort of a march fashion. But the second theme that you hear is this theme that sounds like it could have come right out of, a royal coronation. And it's a perfect example of John Williams being asked by the director to do something that sounds like another composer. And so with the throne room scene, you have the march procession of the Force theme combined with the royal coronation theme. And as a result, you have a great, fantastic finish. So take a look and a listen. And yes, the video cuts off just before the final cadence, but that's just kind of the way it goes. I hope that you've enjoyed this little survey into the music of John Williams, the music of Star Wars. And if you get a chance, what I'd really like you to do is to support one of these wonderful organizations. The Central Jersey Symphony and the Summit Symphony have been operating for 50 and 83 years, respectively, and they are fantastic orchestras. They're fantastic people. In this time of social distancing and sort of uncertainty as to where things are going with our profession of music, it's organizations like these that will lead the charge towards coming back. And I would highly recommend, if you can make a donation to either one of these orchestras, please do so.